creative friends, it's Gwen. The one thing that I get asked over and over is how to create layered embellishment clusters. Even paper lovers who've been creating for a long time can find this tricky. I've created a simple technique called the cluster cake method. It is perfect for beginners and those of you who want to create clusters that you will love. It works on all kinds of papercraft projects, from scrapbooks to journal spreads to cards, and I promise there is no baking required. I've got loads to share, so let's get started. I'm going to be creating with Pink Fresh Studios Some Days collection. I have chosen this line because I know it has lots of little embellishment pieces. It's much easier to create layered clusters when you have quite a few elements and options to work with. So you're going to think of each embellishment cluster as a layered cake. As you get more experience, you can increase the layers in your clusters. I'll start with a 3-layer cluster and we can go up from there. So the base of this cluster is that green tag, and just like a cake, the base layer is the largest. The middle of the cake is that floral cluster and it is medium sized. And then the top layer of the cake is that little square stamped image. That's the idea in its very simplest form, and if you are really new to building clusters, definitely start there. If you are a little more experienced, I want to show you how you can take this idea to the next level. You're going to increase the number of layers in your cluster cake using odd numbers. So 3, 5, 7, 9, 11. Adding more layers will make your embellishment cluster more detailed, but you do need to remember that we're still making a cake. No matter how many layers you add to your cake, you will still always only have 3 sections: a base, a middle, and a top. Imagine a layered wedding cake. The bottom tiers of the cake are always so much larger than the top tiers, and there's a good reason for that. It's not just a matter of practicality and function, it also looks better that way. So for this cluster, the base is the 2 tags, the green one there and the blue one. The middle elements are the floral elements and those lemons. And the 2 round elements are the top of the cake. Did you notice that that stamped element was actually on the top tier of the cake in the first cluster, but for this cluster, it forms part of the middle of the cake? I've done that on purpose to show you that it's not the element itself that determines where it goes in the cake, but more about what's around it and what layers you have happening within your cluster. In the cluster of 3 elements, it formed the top layer. In this cluster, which is 7 elements, it is now the middle layer. I hope that makes sense, and we will make some more as we go along in the video. This video is also part of a much bigger series that I'm doing on embellishment clusters. Turns out I've got a lot to say about them, so if you don't want to miss those videos as they come out, be sure to subscribe. So on to the next cluster, and I want to share some tips with you about the placement of things as I go. The first thing I want to mention might seem obvious, but I find a lot of people get stuck with this. To create a layered embellishment cluster, you need to layer things, and inevitably, that means that pretty things get covered up. It's torturous, I know, but you have to be okay with that. The next thing that I want you to pay attention to is the outside line of your cluster. Anywhere that you have elements meeting each other, there is like an intersecting point. A cluster will look more complicated than it is if those points do not line up exactly. You want to stagger elements. Every time an element sticks out over an edge or does not line up exactly, you create interest. So for this cluster, I have started with a pretty basic shape. It's a rectangle. I've added the tag at the top there and made sure that it extends past the edge of the rectangle. That element there with the lemons on it, it also extends out across the left-hand side of the rectangle, so it breaks up that line that's on the left there. On the right-hand side bottom corner, I've added the wreath element, and that creates interest because there's florals and little leaves that stick out over that edge. So what started out as a very boring rectangle is not that at all. Here's a closer look at the completed cluster. It is a cluster of 7. I do have a rule of 7, which I will actually explain more in a future video. I'll be sure to link that below once it's done. On to the next cluster, and this one runs much more vertically than horizontally. The first two were started with horizontal rectangles, and I did want to show you one that was much more vertical. So the base of this cluster is that blue and green element there, and now I'm jumping straight on into my middle layers, and that is the flower and that green die cut. I want to make this cluster a little more complicated, so I am going to add an extra flower here over the top. I've also added some foam tape behind it just to add a little bit of extra dimension. If I was going to stop the cluster here, it would actually be the top layer of the cluster. But I am going to add in some extra elements, so it will end up being more like a middle layer. I also want to fill out the bottom area of the tag a little bit more, so I'm going to work on that in a moment. While I do that, I also want to mention that a lot of this comes down to auditioning elements, trying things out and seeing if they fit. Remember that this is an edited video, and as such, a lot of my auditioning is cut out of it. I was thinking of doing some of these in real time from start to finish. Let me know if that's something you'd be interested in the comments below. So at this point, I was not happy with that outside edge. It was looking a little bit plain and simple. So I'm going to cut this die cut in half and layer it behind there. It's going to break up the line of that outside edge that I talked about earlier. And it's a good way to do it because you're really just using one die cut and splitting it in half. So this cluster is going to end up with 11 elements, our most detailed one yet. I really hope that you can see the idea of the cluster cake method is scalable. You can keep things simple and just use 3 elements for your cluster, or you can go all out and use 11. It really is up to you, and in time you'll find you'll get your own style with it. Remember, this is your cluster cake. You can make it any style or any flavor that you like. I'm just giving you the basic recipe. So this idea works super well if you have a clear idea of how you want your cluster to look when it's done. But it doesn't tell you where to put each embellishment, so you can end up just pushing things around the page. That's why I made this video right here. It's the one simple way that I found to create the perfect embellishment every time without having to understand the rules of composition and balance. Be sure to watch that video next, and I'll see you all again very soon. Until then, bye!